The veterinarian said the only mercy was a bullet. The fracture was compound, the bone was exposed, and the draft horse was worth more dead than alive. But the farmer refused. He looked at the vet, looked at the horse, and made a decision that would humiliate modern medicine. This was a Belgian draft horse named Atlas, 18 hands tall and the heart of a small family farm. The vet's prognosis was rooted in textbook science and financial sense, but the farmer saw something else in the animal's eyes, a will to fight. And he was willing to bet everything, his reputation and his savings, on a question modern veterinarians rarely ask. What if the science is right, but the patient is wrong? To understand that gamble, you have to understand the man who made it. His name was Walter Granger, and he was born in the same farmhouse he still lived in, the third generation to work those 400 acres in southern Ohio. His grandfather had plowed it with horses, his father with early tractors, and Walter ran it with a mix of both, modern equipment for the fields but draft horses for the woodlot, the hay wagon, and the soul of the place. He believed in doing things the slow way when the slow way was better. He was 62 years old, and in his lifetime, he'd seen the entire vocabulary of farming change. Words like efficiency, yield, and input cost replaced words like stewardship, soundness, and heart. But Walter held onto the old words, and he held onto his horses. Atlas was the last of that line, a 5-year-old Belgian gelding, bought as a yearling, raised not just as an animal but as a partner. Walter's wife, Ellen, had passed away 7 years prior, and his 2 children were grown and gone to the cities. The farm was quiet. Atlas was the living, breathing presence he shared his days with. So on that Tuesday morning in early April, when Atlas didn't come to the fence for his morning grain, Walter knew. He found him in the lower pasture, standing 3-legged, his left foreleg swollen grotesquely from the knee down, hanging at a sickening angle. He'd likely kicked through a rotten fence rail in the night. The bone wasn't just broken, it had shattered through the skin. A compound fracture, the worst kind. Walter didn't panic. He called Doc Harrison, Dr. Samuel Harrison, DVM, Ohio State, class of 1978. He was the only large animal vet for 30 miles, a pragmatic man in his 50s who'd seen this exact scene a dozen times. He arrived within the hour, his blue truck kicking up gravel. He examined Atlas in the pasture, his hands gentle but his expression grim. He didn't need an X-ray. The diagnosis was in the air, in the horse's labored breathing, in the way the leg felt like a bag of gravel when he palpated it. "Walter," he said, wiping his hands on a towel, "it's a comminuted fracture of the cannon bone. The pastern bone is likely involved. There's massive contamination from the dirt. This isn't a fixable injury." Walter stood silently, his hand on Atlas's sweating neck. "Kindest thing," Harrison continued, his voice dropping into the practiced, respectful tone used for these moments, "is to euthanize him here. He's in shock now, but the pain will be unmanageable. He'll never bear weight on that leg again. Even if we could get him to a surgical clinic, which we can't, the cost would be $20,000–$30,000. And the success rate for this, it's effectively zero for a horse his size. He's a draft horse, Walter. 1,500 pounds. They don't heal from this." Harrison opened his truck door, reaching for his kit. He pulled out a syringe and a small bottle. The bottle contained a pink solution, Euthasol, the final mercy. "I'll do it right here," Harrison said. "It's quick, he won't feel a thing, then we can call the renderer." Walter looked from the vet to the horse. Atlas had turned his head, his large, dark eye watching Walter. There was fear in it, but not panic, a kind of weary, trusting confusion. In that look, Walter didn't see a statistic. He didn't see a poor prognosis or an insurmountable medical cost. He saw the colt he'd halter broken, the young horse who'd leaned into his first collar, the companion who stood patiently in the cold while Walter fumbled with harness buckles. "No," Walter said. The word was quiet, but it cut the morning air like a knife. Harrison paused, the syringe in his hand. "Walter, I know he's your friend, but this isn't about sentiment. This is about medical reality. It's about preventing suffering." I said no, Walter repeated louder now. He stepped between the vet and the horse. You're not putting him down. Harrison sighed, a long, frustrated exhale. He'd had this conversation before, too. It never ended well. What's your alternative, Walter? You can't leave him like this. He'll be dead in days from infection or pain. My alternative, Walter said, his mind racing faster than his words, is to fix him. Harrison almost laughed, but it came out as a sad snort. Fix him? With what? There's no orthopedic surgeon in the world who'd take this case. The bone is in pieces. It's not a clean break you can pin. It's gravel. Not with surgery, Walter said, an old memory crystallizing in his desperation. With time, with support, with confinement. My grandfather, he had a plow horse, Bess, broke her leg in a groundhog hole in 1948. The vet said the same thing you're saying. My grandfather didn't listen. He built a sling in the barn. He kept her still. He used poultices and liniments. That horse lived another 15 years, worked until she was 20. Harrison shook his head, a mixture of pity and professional disdain on his face. Walter, that was 1948. That was before we understood infection, before we had imaging, before we knew the mechanics of equine biomechanics. That horse likely had a hairline fracture, a splint bone injury, not this. What your grandfather did was luck, not medicine. This, he gestured to Atlas's leg, this is a death sentence. You're proposing torture because you can't say goodbye. The two men stood facing each other, a gulf of centuries between them. On one side, the weight of modern veterinary science, clinical experience, and economic reality. On the other, the stubborn weight of tradition, personal loyalty, and a story passed down from a grandfather. Get out of my pasture, Sam, Walter said, his voice low and steady. Walter, be reasonable. Get out, you won't help me, fine, but you're not killing my horse, not today. Harrison looked at him for a long moment, then slowly recapped the syringe. He placed it back in his kit. This is a mistake, Walter. A profound, cruel mistake. You're choosing your own feelings over that animal's welfare. When he's screaming in pain tonight, you remember I gave you the humane option. He closed his truck door, got in, and drove away, leaving Walter alone in the silent pasture with a dying horse. Walter didn't have a plan. He had a memory and a defiant, gut-deep refusal. He ran to the barn, his heart hammering. He found old 2x4s, canvas tarp, baling twine. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a farmer. He could build. He fashioned a crude splint, padding it with hay and rags. Getting it on Atlas was an hour of sweating, coaxing terror. The horse flinched and shuddered, but, remarkably, never fought him. It was as if he understood. Then came the real problem, movement. The barn was 200 yards away over uneven ground. Atlas couldn't walk. Walter ran back, hitched his other draft horse, Boone, to the flatbed wagon. He drove it into the pasture, positioned it beside Atlas. With ropes and blankets, using Boone's steady pull as an anchor, he managed to half-lift, half-roll the injured horse onto the wagon bed. It was an agonizing, brutal process. By the end, both man and horse were trembling with exhaustion. He got Atlas into a box stall just as the afternoon sun faded. He filled the stall with deep, soft straw. He rigged a makeshift support sling from the ceiling beams, a harness to take some weight off the leg. He gave Atlas water, but the horse wouldn't drink. The shock was setting in. Walter sat on an upturned bucket outside the stall, head in his hands. The vet was right. This was impossible. He was watching a slow-motion euthanasia, one he'd chosen. The weight of his decision crushed him. Then he heard a soft nicker. Atlas had turned his head, was looking at him. Walter met his gaze. And in that moment, the memory of his grandfather's story stopped being a folk tale and became an imperative. It became a challenge. He stood up. He had made his choice. Now he had to prove it wasn't a death sentence. He had to prove the old ways could still work a miracle. And he had to do it alone, against the judgment of the only expert for miles. The battle was on. The clock was ticking. And the first thing he needed wasn't in a veterinary manual. It was in the woods at the back of his property. What Walter needed was slippery elm, and comfrey, and willow bark. His grandfather's journal, a faded leather-bound book kept on a shelf in the mudroom, wasn't a medical text. It was a ledger of desperation and ingenuity. Entries from the 30s and 40s listed poultice recipes for hoof abscesses, herbal washes for wire cuts, and instructions for fashioning a leg splint from a forked branch and rawhide. Walter read by lantern light that first night, the barn silent except for Atlas's heavy breathing. The old man's script was spidery, but one entry was underlined. For a broken bone, the pain must be managed, the swelling drawn out, and the spirit kept willing. The body will do the rest if you give it time and support. Time and support. That was the entire protocol. Walter became a pharmacist, a nurse, and an engineer. He gathered the inner bark of slippery elm from trees at the property line, boiling it into a thick, mucilaginous paste to soothe the torn flesh around the fracture site. He harvested comfrey leaves, knitbone from his garden, mashing them into a green plaster that smelled of fresh earth. Willow bark, chewed by pioneers for its pain-relieving salicin, was steeped into a bitter tea he mixed with Atlas's water. The splint was the next problem. His first canvas and wood contraption was clumsy and ineffective. On the third day, he drove his old pickup to a junkyard and returned with the front suspension coil spring from a scrapped Ford truck. He heated it in his forge, hammering and bending it into a curved, rigid support that could cradle the leg from knee to hoof. He lined it with sheep's wool and secured it with vet wrap and duct tape. It was ugly. It was heavy. But for the first time, Atlas could rest his leg without the bone ends grinding. The real enemy, as Doc Harrison predicted, was infection. The wound oozed a foul-smelling pus. Walter cleaned it 3 times a day with a solution of salt and boiled water, then packed it with raw, unfiltered honey from his own hives, an ancient antiseptic. He slept in the barn on a cot, waking every few hours to check the horse's temperature, to offer water, to whisper reassurances that felt hollow even to him. After a week, Doc Harrison's truck appeared in the driveway again. He didn't get out. He just watched from his window as Walter emerged from the barn, covered in straw and exhaustion. Harrison shook his head slowly, a silent verdict, and drove away. The news traveled. At the feed store in town, the story was a joke. Old Walt's playing horse doctor. Got that big Belgian rigged up like a spaceship. Going to cost him a fortune in hay just to bury him. The laughter wasn't malicious, but it was certain. They'd all had to make the hard call. Walter's refusal was seen as a sentimental delusion, a stubborn old man's vanity. But a strange thing happened at the 2-week mark. The foul discharge from the wound began to clear. The swelling in the leg, while still enormous, stopped spreading. Atlas began to drink normally. He started nibbling at the sweet hay Walter put right under his nose. The fire of systemic infection, the thing that should have killed him, was receding. Walter's crude, relentless hygiene was working. This is where the veterinary science and the folk remedy collided in a gray zone. Modern studies show that bone, as one equine surgeon put it, is the only tissue that truly heals, and often heals stronger. The real challenge isn't the bone itself, but managing everything around it, preventing infection, supporting the other limbs, maintaining mobility in the joints. Walter, without knowing the terminology, was doing exactly that. The sling took weight off. The frequent turning prevented bed sores. The poultices managed local inflammation. He was manually replicating the supportive care of a high-tech equine hospital. At the 1-month mark, Walter dared to hope. He began hand-walking Atlas for 5 minutes a day, just enough to let the good legs bear weight and circulate blood. The horse hobbled, a tragic stumbling gait, but he bore it. Then on a cool morning in May, disaster struck in a new form. Walter found Atlas standing awkwardly, favoring his right front leg, the good one. The hoof was hot to the touch. The diagnosis was instant and terrifying: laminitis. Support limb laminitis. This is the dreaded complication. When a horse cannot bear weight on one leg, it overloads the opposite limb. The delicate laminae inside the hoof, the Velcro-like structures that hold the bone to the hoof wall, become inflamed and start to fail. The coffin bone can rotate, sink, and eventually protrude through the sole. It is agonizing and often fatal. For Doc Harrison, hearing about it through the rural gossip chain, it was the final grim validation. I told him. Now the horse has two ruined legs. For Walter, it was the abyss. He had fought so hard to save one leg, and now the other was betraying him. The laminitis was a direct result of his treatment, of keeping Atlas alive and mobile. His intervention had created a new, potentially worse crisis. Despair threatened to swallow him whole. He called the only person he could think of, an Amish farmer named Eli Yoder from the next county, known for his way with draft horses. Eli arrived in a buggy. He examined Atlas in silence, feeling the hot hoof, watching the horse's pained expression. "The founder is beginning," he said, his voice soft. "You have a choice, Walter. You can end his suffering now, or you can try to cool the fire." "How?" Walter asked, his voice cracking. "Ice," Eli said simply, "and clay. You must draw the heat from the hoof continuously for days, and you must take more weight off it." Walter had no ice machine. He drove to town and bought every bag of ice from the gas station's drink cooler. He filled rubber tubs with ice and water, and for hours at a time, Atlas stood with his good hoof submerged in a freezing bath. Between soaks, Walter packed the hoof in a poultice of cold clay from the creek bed. He adjusted the sling system to take even more weight off all four limbs, leaving Atlas hovering like a marionette. The battle was now on two fronts, the shattered, slowly healing fracture on the left and the acute, fiery inflammation in the right hoof. Walter's life narrowed to a brutal 2-hour cycle of ice baths, clay packs, wound cleaning, and hand feeding. He lost 20 pounds. The farm work went neglected. The money from last year's harvest began to dwindle, spent on grain, hay, and bags of ice. After a week of this, Eli Yoder returned. He felt the hoof. It was cooler. The digital pulse was less frantic. "The fire is banked," Eli said. "You have perhaps saved the foot, but you must understand, Walter. This horse may never stand normally. Even if the bones knit, he may be a cripple, a pasture pet at best. All this for a pet." Walter looked at Atlas, then at the calluses on his own hands. "He's not a pet," he said. "He's a draft horse. His job is to pull. If he can't pull, then I was wrong. But we don't know that yet." By the 8th week, the impossible seemed plausible. The open wound on the fractured leg had closed over with pink, healthy tissue. The leg was still massively swollen, but the swelling was firm, not puffy. It was callus formation, the body's natural splint. Using the old journal as a guide, Walter began very gentle passive flexion exercises, bending the knee and fetlock joints for a few minutes each day to prevent them from freezing solid. It was at this point that the story stopped being a local curiosity and became a quiet legend. People from neighboring farms began to stop by, not to mock, but to see. They'd peer into the stall at the giant horse in his network of slings and straps, his leg encased in the bizarre metal and duct tape splint, standing in a tub of ice water. They'd shake their heads, but the tone changed. "Would you look at that? The old fool might just do it." Doc Harrison heard these reports. His professional certainty began to curdle into something darker, a personal challenge. He had declared this a death sentence. His authority was built on such declarations being final. One afternoon in late June, he came back, this time with a digital camera. He didn't ask permission. He took pictures of the setup, of the leg, of the homemade splint. "For my records," he said coldly to Walter, "and for the state veterinary board. What you're doing here, Walter, it borders on animal cruelty. You are prolonging suffering because you're too proud to admit you were wrong." "Get off my property," Walter said, too tired for anger. "This isn't over," Harrison replied, getting back in his truck. "You're not a vet. You're practicing medicine without a license, and I'm going to prove it." The threat was real. A report to the board could bring inspectors, seizure of the animal, and criminal charges. Walter's defiance had just escalated from a personal struggle to a legal one. The stakes were no longer just Atlas's life, but Walter's freedom, his farm, and the right to care for his own animal as he saw fit. He was no longer just fighting bone and infection. He was fighting the law. The letter from the state veterinary board arrived 7 days later. It was not a summons, not yet. It was a notice of inquiry. It stated that a complaint had been filed regarding the welfare of an equine under the care of Walter Granger. The board was obligated to investigate. It requested Walter make the animal available for examination by a board-appointed veterinarian at his earliest convenience. The word convenience was underlined in typed ink. It was a command. Walter showed the letter to Eli Yoder. The Amish farmer read it slowly. "They will come," he said, "and their vet will see only what he is told to see. He will see a homemade splint. He will see a horse in slings. He will write a report about improper care and unnecessary suffering. They will take your horse, Walter, and they will put him down to prove their point." Walter felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the summer air. This was no longer about medicine. It was about jurisdiction, about who had the right to declare what was possible. "What do I do?" he asked. Eli was quiet for a long moment. "You must become a documentarian," he said finally. "You must show them a story they are not prepared to see." So Walter began to document. He bought a cheap digital camera. Every day he took 3 photos, one of Atlas's leg from the same angle, one of the wound site, and one of Atlas eating or resting calmly. He started a logbook. He recorded the horse's temperature twice daily. He noted the circumference of the leg, measuring the slow, incremental reduction in swelling. He wrote down what poultices he applied and when. He kept receipts for every bag of ice, every bale of hay. He was building a case file, not for a lawyer but for the truth. He also called the board. He spoke to a polite, detached woman in the office. "I received your notice," he said. "I will comply, but the examination must happen here on my farm. The horse cannot travel, and I request that my own veterinarian be present." "Your own veterinarian?" the woman asked, her tone curious. "Yes," Walter said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Dr. Samuel Harrison. He's familiar with the case." There was a pause, the sound of a pen scratching. "We will note the request. The assigned investigator will be in touch." Walter hung up. He had just invited the wolf to the henhouse, but he needed Harrison there. He needed the confrontation to be direct, undeniable. 2 weeks later, a white SUV with state plates pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a woman in her 40s, Dr. Linda Ferris, the board investigator. She carried a clipboard and a professional, neutral expression. Right behind her in his own truck was Sam Harrison. His expression was not neutral. It was stone. Walter led them to the barn. Atlas stood in his stall, supported by the sling, the metal and duct tape splint on his leg. He turned his head to look at the newcomers, ears forward. He looked alert. He looked calm. Dr. Ferris took in the scene, her eyes widening slightly at the Rube Goldberg apparatus of slings and supports. "Mr. Granger," she said, "this is unconventional." "It's what's kept him alive," Walter said. Harrison didn't wait. "Linda, look at the leg. Look at the grotesque swelling. Look at that primitive splint. This animal has been in constant pain for over 2 months. This is a textbook case of prolonged suffering." Dr. Ferris approached the stall. "May I examine him?" Walter opened the door. "Go ahead, he's gentle." What happened next was the turning point. Dr. Ferris was thorough. She palpated the leg, feeling the hard callus formation. She checked the healed wound site, noting the clean, pink scar tissue. She took Atlas's temperature normal. She listened to his heart and gut sounds, strong and regular. She examined the once foundered hoof on the opposite leg, cool, with a healthy digital pulse. She watched as Walter removed the splint for her inspection. The leg, while misshapen and thick with callus, was straight. The fetlock could flex. The horse tolerated the handling without distress. Harrison watched, his jaw tightening with each normal finding. "The psychological distress is evident," he insisted. "The confinement alone." "Dr. Harrison," Dr. Ferris interrupted softly, still examining the leg. "What was the original prognosis for this injury?" "Euthanasia," Harrison said immediately. "Within 24 to 48 hours, due to septic shock or unbearable pain." And the current clinical signs of septic shock or unbearable pain are, where exactly? She looked up at him, her gaze clinical. He's adapted to the pain. That's not the same as being pain-free. This setup is medieval. It's not treatment, it's custodial torture. Walter spoke for the first time during the examination. He walked to a shelf and brought over his logbook and the printed photos. He handed them to Dr. Ferris. "This is the record," he said. "From day 1. The fever spiked on day 3 and broke on day 5. The wound drainage cleared on day 14. The laminitis crisis began on day 28 and was resolved by day 35. The leg measurements show a reduction in swelling every week since week 6. Dr. Ferris flipped through the photos. She saw the progression. The grotesque, dirty wound becoming clean, then closed. The leg initially ballooned, slowly defining a shape. She saw the dates. She saw the data. It was crude, but it was consistent. It was evidence. Harrison was fuming. This is irrelevant. The standard of care was not met. The appropriate action was euthanasia. Any continuation constitutes neglect. Dr. Ferris said, closing the logbook. "The board's mandate is animal welfare. We assess current condition and evidence of suffering. This animal is alert, responsive, eating, drinking, and his vital signs are normal. The injury site is healed. There is no active infection. The ancillary issues, like the founder, have been addressed. The methods are unconventional, but I cannot, based on this examination, find grounds for immediate seizure or a charge of cruelty." Harrison looked like he'd been slapped. "You're endorsing this backyard butchery." "I am stating my observational findings," she corrected him, her voice firm. "The case will be reviewed by the full board, but my recommendation will be that no action is warranted at this time, provided the owner continues to monitor the animal's comfort closely." She turned to Walter. "Mr. Granger, you will need to have a licensed veterinarian perform a follow-up examination in 1 month and submit the report to the board. That veterinarian," she added, with a glance at Harrison, "can be of your choosing." It was a conditional victory, a stay of execution, but for Walter it was everything. The state had looked at his work and had not condemned it. Harrison left without another word, but the war wasn't over. The professional humiliation in that barn had been public, witnessed by a state official. It demanded a response. A week later, Walter was in the feed store when he overheard 2 men talking at the counter. "Harrison is livid. Says he's going to prove his point once and for all. He's entered that damaged horse of Granger's in the county fair." Walter froze. The county fair. The draft horse pull was the premier event, a test of raw strength where teams pulled a weighted sled. It was Harrison's arena. He was on the fair's livestock committee. Walter confronted him that afternoon at his clinic. "You entered Atlas in the fair. He can't even walk a straight line yet." Harrison smiled, a thin, cold expression. "It's not the pull, Walter. It's the best conditioned draft horse class, judged on overall health, coat, muscle tone, and soundness. It's this Saturday. If your horse is as recovered as you claim, he should be able to walk into that ring and stand for inspection. Let the judges see your miracle. Let the whole county see." It was a trap, a public spectacle designed for maximum humiliation. In the conditioned class, Atlas would be lined up alongside glossy, perfectly muscled champions. His misshapen leg, his uneven musculature from months in slings would be nakedly obvious. The judges would pin him last, a pitiful spectacle. It would be the final visual proof that Harrison was right. The horse was a cripple. Walter's recovery was a sham. To refuse would be seen as an admission of failure. To accept was to walk into a slaughter of reputation. Walter went home and stood in the barn. Atlas nudged his shoulder. The horse was putting more weight on the bad leg every day. He could walk a slow, careful circle in the paddock, but a show ring, under the critical eyes of experts. He thought of the board investigator's report. He thought of the logbook full of data. He thought of his grandfather's journal. This was no longer just about saving a life. It was about defining what a saved life looked like. Did it have to be perfect? Or could it be simply, powerfully asterisk enough? He made his decision. He would go to the fair. He would walk Atlas into that ring. He would accept whatever judgment came. Because the verdict that mattered had already been delivered in the quiet of the barn, in the steady beating of a heart that refused to stop. The public verdict was just noise. But Walter Granger didn't know about the clause in the fair rulebook, the one Sam Harrison had personally insisted on adding to the judging criteria this very year, the one buried on page 6. Fairgrounds on Saturday were a riot of noise and color, a world away from the quiet barn, the smell of fried dough and livestock mixed in the humid air. Walter led Atlas from the trailer, the big horse's ears swiveling at the commotion. He walked with a pronounced stiff limp, the thickened left leg moving in a careful, mechanical arc. To anyone watching, it was a parade of futility. Whispers followed them through the barns. "That's Granger's horse. The one that was supposed to be dead. Look at him hobble." The best conditioned draft horse class was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main ring. The judging was based on 6 criteria: muscling, coat quality, hoof condition, alertness, cleanliness, and overall impression of health. Walter brushed Atlas until his chestnut coat gleamed like a new penny. He polished the one good hoof until it shone. He could do nothing about the asymmetrical muscling. The right shoulder was overdeveloped from months of bearing extra weight. The left was atrophied. He could do nothing about the bowed, thickened leg. They waited at the gate. In the ring, the other horses circled, their movements fluid and powerful, their legs clean and straight. They were specimens of perfection. Atlas stood like a monument to damage. Sam Harrison stood by the judges' table, arms crossed, talking with the 2 judges. He pointed at the rule book in front of them, then gestured toward Walter and Atlas. He was setting the stage. The class steward called Walter's number. "Granger with Atlas, you're up." Walter took a deep breath and clicked his tongue. Atlas stepped forward, and they entered the sunlight of the arena. A hush fell over the crowd. The other competitors and their handlers paused to stare. The only sound was the uneven asterisk clip-clop, drag of Atlas's gait as Walter led him to the designated spot in the lineup. The 2 judges, an older man and a younger woman, approached. They walked down the line of 7 horses, making notes on their clipboards. They reached Atlas. The older judge, a man named Bill with a face worn by decades of judging, stopped. He looked at the leg. He looked at the horse's eye. He didn't say anything. The younger judge, Sarah, knelt and ran a hand down the misshapen cannon bone, feeling the hard, knotted callus. She stood up and met Walter's gaze. There was no pity in her eyes, only intense curiosity. They moved on. The judging took 20 minutes. The horses were lined up, walked in a triangle pattern, and lined up again. Atlas performed each maneuver slowly, deliberately, but without a misstep. He held his head high. Finally, the judges conferred at their table. Bill, the head judge, picked up the microphone. The crowd quieted. "Before we announce the placings," he said, his voice crackling over the loudspeaker, "the judges would like to make a special note regarding entry number 4, Atlas, shown by Walter Granger." Harrison, by the rail, allowed himself a small, tight smile. This was it, the public rebuke. Judge Bill continued, "This class is judged on condition, on the visible evidence of health and care. When we look at this horse, we see something that is not in the rule book. We see a story." He paused. The fairgrounds were silent. "We see a leg that by all medical rights should not be attached to a living horse. We see a coat that gleams from daily grooming. We see hooves that are meticulously maintained. We see an animal that is alert, engaged, and in obvious good flesh. The rule book says we judge what is before us, and what is before us is not just a horse. It is a recovery. It is a testament to an owner's care that goes beyond the standard. Therefore, the judges have unanimously decided to award Atlas the blue ribbon for best conditioned draft horse." For a second there was nothing. Then the crowd erupted, not in cheers at first, but in a wave of shocked murmurs that built into applause. Walter stood frozen, the lead rope slack in his hand. Atlas nudged him as if to say, "Move asterisk." Harrison's smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief. He strode to the judge's table. "This is an outrage. You can't reward a deformity. Look at the rule book, page 6, section C. The animal must be asterisk sound." Judge Sarah picked up the rule book. She turned to page 6. She read aloud, her voice clear and sharp. Section C. Soundness. The horse must be free of lameness at the walk and must not show signs of distress or discomfort that would impede its overall condition. She looked up at Harrison, then at Atlas, who was standing quietly, ears forward. "Mr. Harrison, this horse is not lame at the walk. He has an irregular gait due to a healed injury, but he is bearing weight evenly. He is not showing distress. He is, by the definition of this rule book, sound for this class. You wrote this clause. You should know what it means." Harrison was speechless. He had written the clause to ensure a perfectly conformed horse would win. He had never imagined it would be used to justify a horse like Atlas. Walter stepped forward to receive the blue ribbon. As Bill pinned it to Atlas's halter, he leaned close to Walter. "My father had a horse like this once," he said quietly. "Vet said to shoot it. He didn't. It plowed for 10 more years. I've never forgotten that. Your horse doesn't just have condition, he has heart. And that's what we're really judging today." The victory was seismic. In the span of 5 minutes, the narrative in the county flipped. Walter was no longer the stubborn old fool. He was the man who had done the impossible, the man who had out-stubborn-rid a vet and the odds. Atlas was no longer a pitiable cripple. He was a champion. Harrison left the fairgrounds without another word. He was not seen in public for weeks. The story, of course, reached the State Veterinary Board. Dr. Ferris submitted her final report, noting the fair's judging result as evidence of the horse's objective well-being. The case was closed. No action was taken against Walter. But this story doesn't end with a blue ribbon. Let me tell you about the next year. Harrison's practice suffered. The farmers, who had once trusted his word as gospel, now remembered the times he'd recommended euthanasia for a colicky horse or a cow with mastitis. They started asking for second opinions. They started questioning the fine print on their bills. The man who had represented unassailable authority had been publicly humiliated by a farmer and a horse. He sold his practice 18 months later and moved to a suburb, taking a job as an inspector for a pharmaceutical company. He became a ghost in his own profession. Walter and Atlas returned to work, slowly, carefully. By the following spring, Atlas was pulling a light drag in the paddock. By fall, he was helping bring in the hay wagon, paired with Boone. He would never have the explosive power for a heavy pull competition, but he had strength enough for the farm. He lived to the age of 22, a long life for a draft horse with such an injury. When he died peacefully in his stall, Walter buried him under the oak tree at the pasture's edge. Now here is the surprising detail, the one that changes the flavor of the entire story. After Harrison left, Walter received a letter. It was from Harrison's former clinic, forwarded by the new owner. It was a handwritten note, dated the day after the fair. Walter *it read, "I have spent my career believing in the infallibility of medicine. I believed that if the science said a thing was impossible, then it was. You have shown me that the science only measures the average. It does not measure the exceptional. It does not measure will, the will of an animal to live, or the will of a man to believe in it. I was wrong, not in my diagnosis. The medical facts were against you. I was wrong in my certainty. I apologize for the suffering I added to your burden. I hope you can understand that I, too, was trying to prevent suffering as I saw it. Your horse is a better testament to care than any diploma on my wall. Sincerely, Sam *. Walter never told anyone about the letter. He kept it in his grandfather's journal, pressed between the pages on poultice recipes. He understood that Harrison's humiliation had been a kind of healing, too, a breaking of a different kind of rigid bone. Walter Granger died in 2019 at the age of 80. The farm passed to his granddaughter, who runs it as a small organic operation. And in the barn, on a shelf above the workbench, there are two items. One is a faded blue ribbon from the county fair. The other is an odd, curved piece of metal, rusted now, the homemade splint forged from a truck spring. They are kept there not as trophies, but as reminders. A reminder that the gap between impossible and possible is often just a matter of time and care, and refusing to read the prognosis as the last page. The contract between a man and his animal is written in daily actions, not in ink. And sometimes, the only clause that matters is the one that says, "Try." This is where the story turns and looks directly at you. So let me ask you the question the story is really about. When you are told something is impossible by someone with the credentials, the authority, the weight of an entire profession behind them, what do? Do you accept the verdict? Or do you look for the exception hiding inside the rule? Walter Granger's story isn't just about a horse. It's about the moment your judgment collides with the world's judgment. It's about the cost of believing in something more than the evidence allows. He bet his reputation, his savings, and his peace of mind on a possibility so remote it didn't exist in any veterinary textbook. He won that bet not because he was a medical genius, but because he was a stubborn, attentive caretaker who refused to stop reading the patient instead of the prognosis. But here is the necessary counterweight. For every atlas, there are 100 horses that could not be saved. The veterinarian's prognosis is not a villain decree. It is a statistical prediction born from seeing those 100. The tragedy is not that experts are sometimes wrong. The tragedy is that we demand they be infallible, and so they must speak in certainties, leaving no room for the miracle on the margins. The real tension, then, is not between right and wrong. It is between different kinds of knowledge. The knowledge of the textbook, broad and predictive, and the knowledge of the barn, deep and specific. Walter had a piece of data the vet could never have. He knew the heart of his horse. He knew it would fight. This is the lesson that lingers long after the blue ribbon fades. In our own lives, we face pronouncements of finality from doctors, from bankers, from employers, from circumstances. The diagnosis, the rejection, the dead end. And in those moments, we have to decide, are we looking at a universal law or just the limits of someone else's imagination? Do not hear this as a call to reckless defiance. Hear it as a call to deeper literacy. Walter didn't just hope. He documented. He adapted. He learned. He turned his faith into a daily protocol. His victory was built on meticulous, humble work. The contract he honored was written in blisters and sleepless nights. So what do you do when you're told it's over? You can accept it with grace. That is often the wise and courageous path. Or, if something in you rebels, you can do what Walter did. You can read the fine print of the situation. You can look for the clause no one else remembered. The clause that says living things are not statistics, that says will is a variable, that says care is a force that can alter the geometry of what's possible. You won't always win, but you will always know that you read the document for yourself. And sometimes, on a quiet farm or in your own quiet struggle, that makes all the difference. If you found a lesson here worth remembering, consider subscribing. We uncover more stories like this, tales of forgotten knowledge, quiet rebellion, and the moments when someone decided the ending hadn't been written yet.